Welcome back to the Lutheran History Podcast. Today we're doing part 2 of our interview with Jonathan Wilson concerning his book, God on Three Sides, German Pietists at War in 18th Century America. Last time we talked about two pastors who served in North America during the American Revolution in various contexts and callings. Today we take two more cases. We have perhaps it's our only American-born subject we're going to talk about today, and that's Peter Muhlenberg, the son of the among Lutheran pastors, more famous Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, but according to American Revolutionary War history buffs, this is the Muhlenberg that probably comes out more, so depending on who you ask. Why don't you tell us about Peter Muhlenberg? And there's a lot of myths that pop up around him, and I'd love to hear kind of your take on that and kind of the comparison with his father as well.
Yes, and I hope that in doing some of the work that I had done that I have not alienated, some of our East Coast colleagues who might be really invested in some of the myth of Peter Muhlenberg. But he is someone who served in the American Revolutionary War and compares very favorably in his record with the others who served with George Washington. So John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, call me Peter, was a German American, and he was clergy, but he was actually serving a church that was part of Virginia's Anglican establishment. He had even gone over to England to receive an Anglican ordination to prepare him for that. But then, not long after, he set aside his ordination for a commission that would eventually lead him to Washington's own staff. And with that kind of vocational route that he had taken, his own father had his doubts about the earnestness of Peter's faith. However, I think that we can consider two other things as we determine, some of Peter Muhlenberg's pietist credentials for his inclusion as a case study. And that is, first of all, the church that Peter Muhlenberg served with his Anglican ordination was networked to the Pennsylvania ministerium, and it affiliated with the Lutherans after the war. The Anglican endorsement had been a pragmatic thing to do. These were ethnic Germans that he was serving with a Lutheran liturgy. The second thing to keep in mind is that Peter Muhlenberg then remained committed to the Pennsylvania ministerium himself throughout his life as a layperson, and he appeared, for example, as delegate to its annual meetings and was vocal in trying to steer its course along some of the lines that his own father had in mind. Henry Muhlenberg was someone who saw, the assimilation into English as something that needed to be helped along. And Peter shared that conviction, as is noted in his participation at an annual meeting in the early 1800s. Excuse me.
I'll
Yes,
just
go ahead.
interject just to clarify, why was being Anglican pragmatic? Well, that was the established religion of the colony of Virginia, right? There was certain restrictions and for not being Anglican and some tax perks, I believe, right? If you were, and that seemed
And
to be what
that's
they were doing.
correct. Yes, that's absolutely right, Ben. And then it depended from one colony to another. And so it might be more in the interest of even a Lutheran congregation to tie to the establishment of the colony as in Virginia's case. But in the case of, let's say, Georgia, where maybe laws are structured a little bit differently, to maintain the separate Lutheran identity. But yes, that is the case. And so that is what lies behind Muhlenberg's Anglican ordination. Now, before he gets there to that point, in his youth in the 1760s, Peter went to Germany, and he was already too old at that time for education at the Halle Institutes. He might have been sent earlier, except for the intervention of the 7 Years' War that would have delayed that passage for him. But he was also, on arriving in Europe, not really ready to matriculate at Halle University either. So G.A. Franca, head of the Halle Institutes, arranged an apprenticeship for Peter as a storekeeper, and he had a very miserable time in doing that, treated really as an indentured servant, and so on. But it is also to that time that myths about Peter, the war hero, begin to rise and are set into that context in a family history that was really a hagiography published in 1849, The Life of Major General Peter Muhlenberg by Henry A. Muhlenberg. Supposedly, Peter runs away from his storekeeper and enlists in a regiment in Germany, and as a mercenary, then crosses the breadth of Germany, one enlistment to another, and along the way earns the nickname Devil Pete until he secures his passage back home. Well, this is all nonsense, as the journals and correspondence of H.M. Muhlenberg establish. We have, a window into what had taken place for Peter. He does sail back home after being extracted through his father's intervention and so on from that situation with the storekeeper. And one way that he was able to afford the passage back was that he was recruited as an officer's secretary on that ship. So he returns and is taken under his father's wing for private tutoring and for ministry preparation, where he serves as a catechist and preacher in various locations in New Jersey, especially also Pennsylvania. In this tutelage, he bonds with Christian Strite, who would later receive a testimonial from Henry M. Muhlenberg as the basis for serving Peter's Virginia Regiment as a chaplain. Well, the Patriot cause flared up. Peter ends being recruited into into that cause, even as he is serving the pulpit in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. It is doubtful that he actually removed his clerical gown at the conclusion of his farewell sermon, although that does make for a very vivid picture on the mural that stood at the Gettysburg Seminary, gazed upon with approval by the large portrait of Abdel Ross Wentz. And so it's a neat story. It is far more likely that he concluded his farewell service, removed his robe in the sacristy, and then emerged back in the sanctuary in the colors of a Patriot colonel. And I do rather think, though, that when that happened, that there was a spontaneous outburst in singing A Mighty Fortress in the congregation, and that many men did enlist in his regiment that very Sunday. And so, one way or another, of course, he did have to take the robe off, and that is highly symbolical, highly significant for someone out of that Lutheran background to be choosing what the Augsburg Confession really determines is a lesser vocation under, after having been part of the supreme vocation, the supreme calling, which was to the ministry. But I won't be dogmatic, on any one point in that narrative. If it captures better, to have him take it off at, as he's saying, quoting Ecclesiastes 3, a time for peace and a time for war, then we'll let that stand. But in the Patriot cause, Muhlenberg served with distinction. His command was the only one to meet its objectives at the Battle of Brandywine. But they were unsupported in that. And so then they were commanded to cover 4 miles to another section of the front in order to protect Washington's army in its retreat. And that would preserve the army, and it kept that defeat at Brandywine from being a disaster. The amazing thing about that is that 4 miles was covered in 40 minutes. Those men had already been engaged in the fight. Then they kept up a 10-minute clip with full armament and then formed lines again to cover the retreat of the rest of the army. Muhlenberg was so trustworthy an officer that Washington put him in the unenviable position of sitting on court-martial tribunals over other generals, including colleagues at Brandywine who had come to the field drunk that morning. Muhlenberg was so dependable that his requests for leaves were denied. Washington simply could not spare him. However, Peter Muhlenberg did not rush the redoubt at Yorktown. That really was Alexander Hamilton. Based on Washington's own reports and other documents, Peter Muhlenberg was ill at that stage of the battle, and immediately after the surrender of the Royalists, he requested and received a much overdue R&R at his own Virginia home. I do, Ben, here want to interject something regarding Alexander Hamilton, which is that I made a mistake in God on Three Sides, which is embarrassing to me twice over. First, because it was unnecessary for me to make that mistake in any kind of prose construction, to throw in a detail that turned out to be wrong. Second, it's embarrassing because at the same time that I was working on this, Hamilton was becoming the star of his own Broadway show. And I feel like everyone got the memo except me. And my mistake is that I did not know where Nassau was. And that error makes me feel like I'm walking around with an open zipper or that I have toilet paper stuck to my shoe. It was a mistake, and I can explain it as a function of human frailty, but it is not an excuse. I was not focused on telling Hamilton's story. Rather, I was deconstructing a myth that had entered historiography around 1809 and which was then cited in the family hagiography of 1849. This attribution dates to shortly after the deaths of Hamilton in 1804 and then Peter Muhlenberg himself in 1807. This myth holds that Hamilton had asked to lead the charge, but that his unit got hung up by resistance at the redoubt. So Peter Muhlenberg led reinforcements, and he and Hamilton vaulted over the battlements at the same time. What is possible that Muhlenberg saw the forward regiment waver and sent forward a reserve force, and that he did this himself without consulting Major General Lafayette, as there would have been no need. But he was a command observer in an appropriate post for observing the entire scene. He was not wounded in the battle as the myth recounts. Washington was meticulous in recounting the combat casualties among his officers, killed and wounded. Muhlenberg was ill already. That was why he was sent home. It was to convalesce. By the time this other story starts to circulate around 1809, Muhlenberg himself is no longer alive to rebut it, and Hamilton had come under disgrace and had not yet been rehabilitated by $100 bill or by setting his story to hip hop. Muhlenberg charging the redoubt at Yorktown is a myth without documentary foundation. What the documents actually confirm compels us to reject it. It is also completely unnecessary. His career in the Revolutionary War compares very favorably across the entire general staff, and I do wish that he was more of a household name in the credits of history.
Yes, and you got Brother Frederick too, first Speaker of the House, right? Could be a
Mhm.
whole nother topic as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think we got time to still talk about our last kind of case study. You earlier had all these people are going through transitions except for Muhlenberg, the elder who wants to just stay put, right, and let everything go on by. But we now have another Hala modeled community in Georgia with its own pastor, another seat of war, lesser front than famous battles like Yorktown or Brandywine, but still a major campaign in the later half of the American Revolution that was affected as well. So, could you tell us about Friedrich Christoph Triebner and Ebenezer in Georgia?
Thank you. It's in Triebner that we have someone who might just deserve overall obscurity. He was sent by Halle to the German Lutheran settlements in Ebenezer, in Georgia. He was young, he was inexperienced, and when he arrived, he became an alienating and divisive presence in the consistory of Lutheran churches and pastors that were present in Ebenezer. Well, his credentials as a pietist, as such, are that he was vetted by Halle to head to Georgia after the death of Michael Boltzius, the Halle pietist who had been the colony's founder. After the war, Triebner was received by German Lutheran congregations in London, and he published some speculative works in eschatology related to the French Revolution. Well, speculative eschatology is a wrinkle in the imagination of many pietists, including Lutheran pietists such as Johann Albrecht Bengel from out of Tübingen. Well, in the conflicts that Triebner provoked, which H.M. Muhlenberg himself came down from Pennsylvania to mediate, Triebner does not acquit himself well at all. However, it is also clear that the community's sense of purpose had been fraying with the advent of slaveholding, a drift in Ebenezer's mission, which Boltzius had opposed, but which had started to be taken for granted by all sides by the time of Triebner's arrival. After H.M. Muhlenberg mediated a settlement that all parties signed on to, he returned to Pennsylvania. Well, then the sides broke along the partisan sympathies of the Patriot Rebellion, with Triebner identifying as an ardent loyalist, and his chief opponent in the earlier conflict was the magistrate John Adam Treutlen, who was elected to the Patriot Assembly of Georgia and then was elected the first Patriot governor of Georgia. Now, this makes John Adam Treutlen a heroic figure among early immigrant German Americans as he identifies and climbs the ranks of patriot government in the revolutionary period. And yet, I posit that the received historical narrative now does stand in need of correction. There was a woman who, when her pregnancy began to show, testified, she was unmarried, she testified that she had actually been assaulted by a man who had since died after that attack. That dead man's wife confirmed this testimony. Despite that, Magistrate Treutlen accused Pastor Triebner of being the father. The narrative has been predisposed to accept the suspicions of Treutlen and to convict Triebner and to ignore the testimony of a woman who suffered sexual assault. And I got into that in an article I published for the 2018 volume of the Journal of the Lutheran Historical Conference, Truth versus Power in Colonial Georgia. Triebner was removed from the pulpit on the basis of that accusation by his Halle supervisors. When the British invaded Georgia, as you mentioned, Triebner scouted for the force, which was under the command of Archibald Campbell, leading them down the trails from Savannah to Ebenezer. The Royalists then installed Triebner back in the pulpit of the Jerusalem Church of Ebenezer, the church that was in the town, and basically installed him by decree. He served another 3 years, and the church book of Jerusalem shows that he performed numerous baptisms and weddings, and that the woman with that out of wedlock child served as a sponsor or a witness for these baptisms. After Yorktown, the British withdrew from Georgia, and Triebner went with them. And then he enlisted and served as a garrison regiment chaplain in St. Augustine, Florida. He served in that role from 1782 to the end of the war. After the war, he offered to return to Ebenezer, and the response was that he would be welcomed back to Ebenezer if his desire was to be hanged. So instead, he departed for London and served in Lutheran ministry and published his books out to the end of the 18th century.
All right. So you gave us excellent, detailed overview and entertaining, I should might add, overview of at least four of these case studies. It's not the whole book, even what you covered. A lot more in these chapters. So, of course, in this podcast, we can't do the whole audiobook version at all. I just want to get a dip our toes in it, but we got some solid content, of course, too, from this. So, encourage people if they found any of this interesting, a good blend of just straight up history of what's happening, shedding light, throwing light on people and perspectives that you rarely hear from, if at all, from this time period, and of course the religious aspects as well. So excellent
I appreciate that.
content.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, good. Kind of the book I've been waiting for a lot. As a history buff, where Lutherans in the Revolution, not much out there, but this one definitely
Hmm.
puts a big dent into the topic. Well, let's just kind of wrap up then some concluding thoughts. Listeners maybe noticed that you did a lot of work to really analyze what's kind of the myth or the narrative or the legend, whether it's meant to be misleading or not. But you kind of looked at it. Do the actual primary sources back this up? So why is that important to get deep into the sources for this sort of work?
When I saw this question, the first thing that came to mind was, which comes first, the premise or the proof? We need to be reading as historians, we need to be reading critically, we need to be reading appreciatively and widely so that we can set a framework for that particular historic context and what we might learn from it, whatever our focus is. I did not invent my premise out of a vacuum and then set out to prove it. My premise that shared faith does not predict shared partisan alignment was expressing a conclusion that I arrived at from the sum of reading that I had reached at a certain point. And then from then on, I proceeded to read more. As far as discursive materials, H.M. Muhlenberg left a copious amount. Melsheimer left a lot. Triebner left some. Peter Muhlenberg left only a little. Some have wondered if any of these others can really be said to have actually shared H.M. Muhlenberg's pietistic faith. And also, some have been skeptical, as you mentioned, that H.M. Muhlenberg was really all that much in alignment with G.A. Franke and his father, August, in terms of pietistic priorities. For myself, I do not share that outlook or that skepticism. As a self-described pietist, I recognize what these others have in common with each other, some more, perhaps some less. I don't agree, for example, that Melsheimer's education in Karpov the Fourth's orthodoxy mitigates the conclusion that he became a pietist, when what he describes to Johann Etwein is an experience that resonates across the pietistic description of regeneration. I don't agree that Triebner's fall from grace at the hands of John Adam Treutlen proves that he was an impious impostor with no business in the pulpit. His success in London suggests that he also had a vocation and that he was appreciated.
Yeah, and I appreciate how you said you don't. We're not approaching this in a vacuum. You have your own perspective, and you're bringing that to this, and just being open about that just helps us kind of analyze what's happening here. But you're rooting your arguments in the documents and the sources, and doing that critically, as any historian worth his salt, so to speak, would do. So that's appreciated as well. But I did notice, though, and this is now speaking one pastor to another, although in different denominations here, just the idea of understanding the pastoral task and vocation. In my experience, that kind of gives a unique insight into actually analyzing pastors of the past, even though we weren't there. So that's my final question for us today. How does being a pastor, researching and writing about pastors, affect your analysis of them?
Yes, I appreciate that, Ben. Thank you, because I agree with you. I think that we do have a perspective that we can bring. I have had reviewers of this volume who have questioned whether this is a legitimate reading strategy for the discursive materials of historical clergy. We are to read suspiciously of motives. We are to read critically of power and its dynamics, especially if those are blind spots in an author's perspective from the dominant culture. We are to read appreciatively of Sitz im Leben, so that we may contextualize the assertions of the author. My rhetorical question would be, is there room to read collegially? Is there enough shared experience across 5 centuries of Protestant ministry where perhaps another pastor can provide insights that are insufficiently available from these other lenses when viewing the discursive material left behind by clergy? And a lot of pastors have left behind discursive material. We enjoy words. Those who look to Luther as the headwaters of their theological tradition, and I would include myself, have written in great abundance. As a pastor, I might find more of this material more interesting and even more germane than others might. And for this reason, that there can be real empathy between author and reader.
I think that's a key, just historiographical comment you made there. Can we read this with unique, maybe an advantage as collegially, as you said, the historiography of the church doing its own church history? We can appreciate tools and points made in kind of a secular realm, but there's something unique about doing it this way too. Luther's Eighth Commandment, for example, I think you applied that in some of these cases too, which was appreciated as well. So I know you put a lot of work, not just, of course, into all these articles, your dissertation in the book. You did a lot of work just prepping for this podcast. So Pastor and historian Wilson, thank you so much for your time today and your participation.
It was my privilege. Thank you very much. I had a great time.
This podcast has been made possible in part by regular contributions from Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, MJ Hinman, Noah and Abby Broyles, Steve Zank, Rosa, Scott Henrich, Jeremy Correll, Deborah Hilger, and Mikhail Langer. If you'd like to become a regular contributor to the Lutheran History Podcast, you can do so directly on our Buzzsprout website or through Patreon.